hopefully, have time to meet your goals, but also have time to do other fun things with your life and effectively so that you can actually experience the success that you want on your exams and important assessments in your life. Some background information about me. As Jared mentioned, I do teach AP psychology and other psychology courses at Chippewa Falls Senior High School. I have a master's degree in counseling psychology, and I am also a licensed professional counselor, so I see psychotherapy patients. I also am very involved with the College Board. So for those of you who are preparing for AP exams, and that's your interest in maybe why you're focusing on studying at this point in the year, I have been an AP exam reader for psychology for many years now, and I'm a table leader, so I help people like faculty members understand how the national test is scored and help write some of the rubrics for the national test. So I've been helping students prepare for successful performance on the AP Psych exam for many years now, since 2004. So I'm thankful that I have a background in psychology because it turns out there's a wealth of information from psychology and particularly from cognitive science that can help us pick more effective study strategies so that we can experience the success that we want. So let's go ahead and get started. We're actually going to begin by finding out what you know and what you think about different study strategies. So there's a question on the screen and we're going to launch it as a poll in a moment here. But the first thing I want to ask you about is which of these things do you think is the most effective study strategy? So you got many choices, like using a lot of flashcards, like if Quizlet is your BFF, like maybe that's what you're going to go for, taking a practice test or a quiz, rereading key chapters in your textbook, reviewing material in brief sessions spaced out over time, spending time connecting the material to other things that you know or learn, highlighting key portions of your text or notes, going over your notes multiple times, mixing up material from other units and practicing it together, or explaining what you are learning to yourself or others. So many choices, but we're going to go ahead and launch that poll question. I'm curious to see what you guys think about that one. Okay, so I'll give you a few seconds to respond. Good, good. Thanks everybody for responding. All right, good. We got a couple people yet to respond, so we're gonna just do a countdown of like 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Get those answers in. We're gonna end that poll and we're gonna see what you thought. Okay, so you should be able to see some results here. Looks like our highest or most favorite item here is taking a practice test or a quiz, and that's great. Lots of us like using flashcards, spreading out study session, spending time connecting material to what you know. We got going over your notes, got a few explanatory stuff. Okay, I like it. All right, so next we're gonna take a look at a very similar, very related question. Okay, same choices, but this time I'm gonna ask you, what study method do you think students prefer? Like, what do you think the most popular study strategies are out there that are used by students? So same choices, not what's most effective, but what students are using. Oh, and you guys are doing great. You're super speedy on this one. This one, I feel like you must feel like you've got more expertise on this because holy cow, our answers are coming in real quick. Okay, same deal. We just got a couple people left to respond, so we'll give them a nice countdown. In 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2-1 when we're ending it. And let's take a look at those results. Okay. Looks like a lot of us felt that flashcards were quite popular. Okay. Yeah, I don't disagree with you there. I think that's probably accurate. Um, let's see what we got here. Okay. Some of us think it take going over your notes multiple times. Okay. Yeah, I've seen that happen too. Okay. So like we must be getting some of the same views of students here. So your views and my views seem to line up there. So let's talk about what that stuff means. Okay. Because you guys in your responses seem to give the exact same kind of information that researchers have uncovered regarding the divide between like, here's what we know about what works and here's what people are doing. Those might be sometimes kind of different things. So the diagram that I'm going to put on screen here, I titled an infuriating Venn diagram because at least to instructors, this sometimes can be tragic, or it looks rather tragic, because for one, we got some great news. Cognitive science and research in psychology has uncovered several different strategies that we know are high impact that will help people retain more information in memory. And they include things like, I'm going to give you the fancy psychology terms for them here: retrieval practice, so like drawing information from memory. So practice testing is retrieval practice. Distributed practice, spacing out your study sessions over time. Elaborative rehearsal, connecting that information to stuff that you already know or relating or comparing it. Interleaving, which is kind of a fancy one. I'll be talking about that one a little bit later. That's mixing up different content as you're studying it. And self-explanation, describing the process of how to solve a problem as you're solving it. Those things tend to have at least high to moderate impact on people's studying. The ones that students tend to use the most don't overlap with that very much. So like, Venn diagrams are supposed to have this nice like between space where there's an overlap. There's not a whole lot when it comes to these things. Like, here's what works, and then here's what people are doing, and that is frustrating. And maybe we can do some fixing of that. The more we can focus our study strategies into these kinds of things, the more successful we'll be, and the more time we'll have for other fun things in our lives. Now, noted, although you guys did note, yeah, those are kind of popular. Flashcards are this weird in between space because like flashcards as a strategy are kind of too broad to classify as a research method because people use them very differently. So it's hard to make blanket statements about like, do flashcards work or not, because it really depends on what you're doing with them. So we are going to talk about how to use them and maybe some things that we should not do. And I'm also like, if you're interested in the citations for this, I'm primarily drawing or summarizing conclusions from a paper meta-analysis that was done by several cognitive psychologists. And I'm happy to connect you with that research if you're interested in the specifics of their work and how they arrived at this list. But to summarize, so if you're thinking back to those poll questions we looked at a moment ago, here's kind of the summary. Okay, the ones in green, super good. We're going to talk about how you can use those effectively. Thumbs up, double thumbs up on those. The ones that are in bold, pretty good. Like those would not be bad uses of your time because they seem to have at least moderate impact on memory. Flashcards, big maybe. It's kind of like fire, can warm your house or it can burn it down. So like use with caution. The other ones, just run away. Do not, okay, rereading your textbook, please no. Like just please no for all kinds of reasons. I'll explain why in a few minutes. Like my game plan here is to step you through each of those 5 high impact strategies so you can get a sense of how you'd use it. But, I will get to the why we don't reread and stuff in a minute. But, it's actually best practice for changing people's behavior first to give them stuff that they should do rather than stuff that they shouldn't do. So we're going to start with the do's first. Okay, so do number 1, retrieval practice or practice test. In practice, stuff from memory. The act of retrieval is pulling it out of memory, maybe by answering a question or producing the information from memory by writing it out. One super helpful thing that you can do, especially for those of us that might be preparing for AP exams or cumulative finals for a class, if your teacher has graciously provided you with practice tests. You want to get your hands on as many of those as you can. For some like AP subjects, even if your teacher hasn't provided them, they might be available on websites or in practice books, but the more practice tests you can take, the better. In part because what that's doing when you're retrieving that information is it's strengthening the connections between the neurons that end up responsible for you using that information. So you're literally kind of like changing your brain in a way that makes it more likely that you'll be able to retrieve that information in the future. And of course, when you take those practice tests, you want to check over your work. Like, don't, I sometimes worry that you might feel that I'm insulting your intelligence by pointing that out, but like, I definitely have had students that'll just go through and fill those out, never bother to check and see if they got those things right or not. And then, well, that was a fun exercise that you just did. I mean, like, there was some benefit from it because you're retrieving as you do it. But if you don't figure out what you got right or wrong, that doesn't help you like improve on that. So if you're missing some stuff, you maybe ought to figure out like why you're missing it, follow up with your teacher, follow up with another classmate, or look it up in your book. So make sure you can get those questions right the next time. If you can't find existing practice tests, because maybe they just don't exist for that subject area or for that course, you could always try and create your own and then like swap with a friend. So you could test each other by presenting each other with new information or new types of questions you might ask about that same content. Now, short of a practice exam, retrieval practice can be as simple and old-fashioned as just like closing up your book, closing up your notes, setting them aside, and then trying to recall from memory the thing that you need to recall. So if you're trying to remember like the steps of mitosis or meiosis for a biology class, close up that book of notes, see if you can like write them out or maybe draw them out from memory. And when you hit a space that you can't do anything with that anymore, well, then it's time to go back to the notes and like fill in the gaps and try again until you can actually recall that thing successfully. That'd be an indicator that you might be ready to go on that particular topic on your test. So retrieval practice, super good, especially if you can harness some practice tests. But even short of that, you can probably find some ways to do some retrieval. Now, this is where the flashcards come in. Okay, because some of you, because you're smart, some of you are probably thinking to yourself, like, wait, can't I use flashcards to do that? And the good news is, yes. Like, so if you are using flashcards to do what I was just describing, like to try and test what you can pull from memory, then that's an effective use of flashcards. So if you're actually like using Quizlet or using flashcards where you look at the term and then you try and pull from memory the definition or an example of that thing. Cool. You're doing the same thing as you would kind of on a practice test, and that can be an effective memory aid. Even better, if you have printed flashcards, organizing them according to how they relate to each other. You can see in the graphic over here, somebody kind of like mapping out in kind of a hierarchical organization, how those different terms relate to each other. Like here's a major topic and here's different subtypes of it. That can help enhance memory because now you're connecting concepts, and that's elaborative rehearsal. So great. The other big benefit that you could glean from using flashcards if you're doing it correctly is improving your own metacognition. Metacognition is an awareness of what you know and do not know. So I have students that kind of intuitively decide that they're going to, when they go through their flashcards, they're going to make a pile of ones that they know and could successfully recall and ones that they don't know. Now that's good because it helps you isolate what kinds of things you might need to spend time on, makes you more aware of like this stuff I got, this stuff I don't. Do be careful about that though, because the research also suggests that students are very quick to foreclose on the idea that they've mastered something. So they're often too quick to put it in the I knew that pile. And you may actually have to successfully retrieve that thing from memory 3 times before you should be convinced that you actually know that. A lot of people will do it after just once. Like, oh, I got that one time, done. But like, does that really mean 3 days from now I'm going to be able to get that thing? Like, some bold overconfidence there. But okay, here's why we got to be really careful, because I definitely have had students that like sometimes they underperform on a test and they're understandably disappointed and they're very frustrated because they're like, but Mrs. Welle, like I studied for hours on quiz, like I studied so much, and I don't disbelieve them. They may have done that. Like you can spend a lot of time studying, and if you're using just less effective strategies or like approach that's not very helpful, kind of get nowhere. It's like you get stuck in the mud. And the danger with flashcards is like some students, the way they're using them is they're just like looking at them a lot, so they'll pull up one, they'll be like, look, great. Cool, like, and if you're just looking at stuff, like that actually doesn't help fix stuff in memory at all. You can look at something a million times and not remember it. So looking is not retrieval practice. Like that doesn't do it. That's also why like looking over your notes, like that's not really studying directly. Like we need to get to the point where we're pulling it from memory. The other danger about flashcards too is it does kind of encourage people to focus just on memorizing definitions of things, which might be fine for some classes. Like if all your instructor wants you to do is memorize definitions, sometimes that's actually what you're doing. Like, maybe in a med term class or something, like you really literally just need to know what this thing means. But more often, teachers are going to ask you to understand that concept, compare it with other ones, pick out a real life example of that thing, and if all you did is word to word, like rotely memorize the definition, you might find yourself kind of falling short on a test. And it may ultimately be a really poor simulation of what the actual test is going to look like, because unless the test is just like matching vocab, you might have this false sense of confidence, like, oh, I knew all that vocabulary, but then all of a sudden when I got to spot examples or pick like which is the best thing to use in this situation or something, like, we're not there yet. So caution with the flashcards. I'm not saying don't do it, but I'm saying make good choices about how you're using the flashcards. Okay. So, first major study strategy, retrieval practice, which you could use flashcards for maybe if you're doing it right. Second major important and research supported approach to effectively studying is by spacing out those practice sessions and study sessions over time, which if you have so if you are a student who's looking forward to or anticipating AP exams, which will start up, the first week of those things is starting up next week already, and you haven't started studying yet, like this is for you. Like this is hard to do because most of us have been told, by most of our teachers, probably from first grade onward, that like don't cram, like don't leave everything until the night before the test. It's a bad idea. We should, if we're going to study for 5 hours for an AP exam, it's much better to do that spaced out for half an hour each of every weekday for 2 weeks before that test than it is to do 5 hours on the night before the test. Notice that's not an efficiency thing. Even like we're not saying study more. We're saying take that same amount of time and spread it out. That's not just because your teachers want you to be like good planners and to not procrastinate, although those are good things too. Like those would be great skills to learn. The reason that the spacing effect or the space practice stuff works is because what you're trying to do is trick your brain, which has evolved to forget stuff most of the time, to not do that. The human brain we think of as like a memory machine, but it's actually a forgetting machine. Most of the stuff that it takes energy for your brain to maintain neural connections so that you can store information. If your brain just went about storing every piece of information that you encountered one time at one moment, that would be wildly inefficient. So it's actually kind of meant to dump most stuff, especially if you don't encounter it multiple times and it's not super relevant to your survival. Like we can pick up survival related stuff like, oh, don't pet that cobra, like really quick. Maybe that only takes one time of getting bit for you to remember that if you live, but like that might only take one presentation, but like most other stuff, like, I don't know, like Erickson's 8 stages of psychosocial development or order of operations in a math class or something, like that kind of stuff's not survival related. So your brain's going to need multiple exposures to it over time to be like, oh, that's not one of the things I'm supposed to just dump like right away. So for those of you that are enrolled in an AP psychology course right now, this might seem super familiar. This is Herman Ebbinghaus's famous forgetting curve. What it's communicating is that if you learn something to mastery, which is also, that's wildly optimistic. That assumes you know everything. Like most people actually don't get that far in a single class period. Like they don't leave the class knowing everything about the topic, but let's assume that you do. Like once you've learned that to mastery, over time, your attention to that stuff is going to drop off super quickly, to the point where even, and keep in mind, like this access is not even scales here. So but here's where we're getting 24 hours out. So after about 24 hours, you're probably forgetting 70 to 80% of the stuff that you're presented with. That's not because your brain is terrible, but that it's doing what it's supposed to do. What spacing does in practice is make sure that it disrupts that forgetting curve. So not only does it bring us back up to like hopefully 100% retention when we study well, but if you notice each of these peaks, then as you drop off as time since the first learning passes, the amount that you're retaining tends to go up. So we need to space out our stuff over time. It's not just because like, we want you to be planners, although that's helpful. Okay, and speaking of forgetting, hey, let's see how quickly that sets in, everybody. A few minutes ago, I showed you a slide that listed 5 strategies that are research supported, that help people retain stuff in memory on a scratch sheet of paper or post-it or in your hand or like whatever, using a writing instrument that you have. See if you can write them down. Do we remember what they were? That was just a few minutes ago. It's like 5 slides back. Let's see what we got. Oh, there it is. Okay, so that I only gave you 30 seconds because I don't want you to hurt yourself over this. Okay, but like, we'll see if we can remember. There was only 5 things, right? It was on that Venn diagram slide. It's just a few minutes ago, but dang it, Ebbinghaus, that darn forgetting curve sets in so quick. Like we lose that stuff really quick. Oh, my slide there, go. Okay, so here is our list. You can kind of check your own work, see how you did. Retrieval practice and distributed practice, which are the 2 that we've talked about so far. And then elaborative rehearsal, which I'll touch on momentarily, interleaving, and self-explanation were our other 3. So look at what happened there. First up, looking at things didn't automatically get it into our brains, and it very quickly fell right out as you would expect it to. So that's why we got to space out our practice. But what you guys just did, if you wrote them down, that's retrieval practice. So it's more likely to stay in your brain long after we're done with this short talk, because you tried retrieving it and found out maybe that some of them weren't there. But maybe you got them all. If you did get them all, like, claim that glory by telling us about it in the chat, because good job, you. That'd be impressive. So our first 2 high effective study strategies: practice testing or retrieval practice, and distributed practice. So you want to space out those study sessions over time. So if you're taking like the AP Gov test next week, you got about a week left, so make sure that you're doing a little bit of studying every night. Don't try and do it all at once. Now, elaborative rehearsal is just a fancy way of saying like you want to not just recall the information, but connect it to other information. And there's tons of ways that you can do that. I tend to encourage my students, because AP psychology has a lot of terms that are kind of subtle. They're similar to each other, but then there's subtle differences between those concepts as well. Making comparisons when you use flashcards or when you're like learning different concepts, figuring out why are these 2 things kind of the same? What's different about them? How would these 2 researchers disagree about this topic? Helps connect it to meaning. Using the self-reference effect by connecting the information back to your own personal experiences, even better. We have superior memory for stuff that we feel is personally relevant. So rather than just trying to memorize all these concepts, see if you can figure out how you might use them in a future career, or maybe how you have used them in the past. That's going to be a little bit better than just trying to rotely recall them. As an example of that, I do a demo that maybe if you are in AP psychology, you might have seen a similar iteration of in your own classes. But with my AP Psych students, each year I present them with a list of words. They're presented about a second apart. They're random things like volleyball and map and banana or things like that. And one half of the class is given the direction that as each word is presented, they have to count the vowels in those words. So they're going through and circling the number of vowels as each word comes up. The other group is asked to rate how useful that item would be if they were stranded on a desert island. And then I give them a filler task. So I tell them to like write down their zip code and like their favorite cookie or something. So they're not just relying on working memory, and ask them to recall as many of the words from the list as they can. As you can see from the data that comes in from that, pretty consistently, the people who are asked to rate how useful the item would be if stranded on a desert island remember almost 50% more of the words compared to people who are just counting vowels. And the cool thing about that is it doesn't take more time. Thinking about the meaning or the purpose of the thing doesn't take more time than doing some other shallow task, but it does yield high retention and memory. So thinking about how you're going to use it, thinking about how it's meaningful, how it's important, super useful study tool. Now this one I don't introduce directly to my AP students, although it does show up in some of their like study tasks that they do. Interleaving refers to the difference between blocked practice and practice that you mix up a little bit. So if you look on the diagram here on the screen, when people start studying, oftentimes their first temptation is to do blocked practice. So they'll be like, I'm just going to study this unit first. And make sure that, I'm going to do a bunch of different practices on it over and over again until I feel like I've got it all. And then I'm going to turn my attention to unit 2. And I'm going to study that. And here's unit 3. That seems like it would make sense. I mean, I get why people go there because it seems intuitive. And it seems like you're making really good progress. The progress comes fast. But there's actually research that suggests if you mix up content from those units, you might do better. And that's particularly true for some subject areas. Math is one of them. In mathematics, one of the reasons interleaving is so important is because if you think about it, when you're taking a math class, when you test on that topic, you're actually being tested on 2 things. Can I use this algorithm or this process to solve this problem? And can you recognize when you use this algorithm versus another one? Right? Like, how do I use this process for this type of item, or what do I need to use a different formula here? So this interleaving stuff teaches you to look for and distinguish between different types of problems. So if that's an important part of performance for that subject area, then interleaving is going to matter a lot more. For my subject area, just making sure you mix up the content from the units is sufficient for that. For math, and physics and chem, it's especially important because you might have to be able to spot what type of problem that you need to solve, not just how to solve it. The one danger here, just like alert, your progress is going to feel slower when you're doing interleaving. So if you mix up like all your flashcards from all the units, if you do a mixed practice type of test, it's going to feel gross because you're going to be like, oh, I just had a struggle to solve this one. Now I got to struggle to solve a different one and struggle to solve a different one. But like eventually the progress comes with like better performance because you can accurately distinguish between those different types of problem sets. And our last high impact study strategy is self-explanation. This one is also kind of subject specific, but it has its highest impact when people are trying to do very abstract problem solving. So like how to use an algorithm in a math class, how to balance chemical equations in a chem class, memorizing the steps of mitosis, meiosis, being able to explain those things. So in this strategy, what you're doing is as you solve the problem, you explain and like maybe say out loud what steps you're taking as you do it. And why that's the right way to solve the problem. Even better if you've got a study buddy that you could explain it to, because then the explaining doesn't feel so dumb or weird. Or you could draw it out, like draw out the steps to solve the problem. But the reason it's very helpful is it improves that metacognition of problem solving. You're not just like doing the thing, you're being very consciously aware of how it is that you go about solving the problem, and you're more likely to maintain that process in memory. Now, I did promise I would tell you like why I'm just not a fan of rereading, everybody. So if that was like your go-to, I don't mean to break your heart, but like here's why. Okay, like please. Okay. So for one, I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but like rereading an entire like 900-page textbook is very time consuming. So like if you're getting to the end of you're studying for an AP exam, holy cow, that's a big investment of your time. And I could almost see that would be helpful, if you had that time, if it did anything for your memory, but it probably won't. Okay. So, and now I'm Actually, and let's be clear about this, I do literally mean rereading. If you like never read chapter 8 and you're like, well, the AP exam is coming up, I'm going to go reread chapter 8. Like, you're a liar. You're not rereading it. You're reading it for the first time. And okay, you probably should read that. Like, yes, like you do need to get introduced to the content. But if you did already kind of read it with fidelity the first time, going back and rereading it could actually make your performance worse. And here's why. Most people, when they're rereading, they're not reading it in the same way that they did before, and that's okay. But what they're doing is they're just going through and like reading the content, being like, oh, well, that looks familiar. Oh, yep, that looks familiar. That looks familiar. Great. So they're telling themselves, this looks familiar. And then we mistakenly think when something looks familiar, that means I know it. That means I could answer a question about it. That means I could explain it to somebody else. Having something look familiar means none of those things. It just means it looks familiar, and it should look familiar. You read it once, right? So the problem is, like, people will read and they'll have this familiarity bias, it's called. And then they'll be like, I know all this. And then like get really surprised when they actually can't recall some of that stuff on the test. So it's much better to do like practice testing to uncover that stuff. Now, I'm not saying like don't ever go back to your textbook, because of course, if you are doing practice testing and you find out you're missing some certain types of items, yeah, go back and do some targeted rereading of the few paragraphs on that thing that you're missing, because maybe you didn't understand it right. Maybe you do need a refresher in memory before you can start applying it or something. Like, that's fine. But rereading like all of, oh dear, like that's just, I've sometimes had students be like, oh, Ms. Welle, like, I'm going to do so great on this test. I reread the whole chapter last night. And I'm like, oh no, like this person might be disappointed later. Oh dear. Okay. But and highlighting too, like that's a little dangerous. Like, students do tend to like that one, but oftentimes when people are highlighting, they're doing it kind of mindlessly, and memory is the residue of thought. Like, you have to think about the content in order to remember it. There's no getting around that. So if you're just like, I don't know, if you're just highlighting stuff without thinking about it, you're just coloring. Like, that's it. And coloring is fun, but and I'm not anti-highlighter. Highlighters are cool to look at. And if you use them to like sort and organize content according to like what it connects to or something, cool. Well, now we're doing elaborative rehearsal, and highlighters are totally fine for that. But it's really easy to not do that. And a lot of people just like highlight everything in a particular passage in their textbook and their notes, and then that's not even a good study tool later. So it's really easy to do it wrong. So careful. Okay. So if you're picking good, like high impact strategies, you want to stick to the ones that we've been talking about tonight. So practice testing, distributing practice over time, doing some elaborative rehearsal and interleaving, and maybe self-explanation depending on the type of content that you're doing. And let's avoid the rereading. Use caution with the flashcards. Okay. So I don't know, that concludes all of like my formal presentation, but I'm happy to answer questions that you might have about studying, especially with AP exams on the horizon. So if you have any, you're welcome to throw them into the chat. If you're comfortable unmuting, I think participants are able to do that if our settings should allow that. So you're certainly also welcome to unmute and ask a question.
Mrs. Welle, I'll kick off the first question. So for those that have not quite begun their studying plan that they had otherwise planned to carry out for AP testing, and knowing that there's only a week to 2 weeks left until that exam, what would you suggest as a study plan for that?
Okay, great question, Jared. Okay, so again, like if you think back to like, high impact study strategies, I would try to get my hands on something that would approximate some sort of diagnostic test. So I would try to like take a practice test that reflected the different areas of the test. For like an AP exam, because that's on a lot of people's minds, most study review books will have like a short one of those at the beginning, 10 to 15 items, and they'll tell you what chapters or units those things relate to. So that can help you kind of get a sense of, okay, well, I know this unit, but that unit's going to need a lot of work. And once you figure out which areas might need more of your time, then pull out the calendar and literally start writing in what days and timeframes you're going to do the studying, and be realistic about it. Oftentimes people are like, oh, well, I've got, I don't know, 2 weeks or whatever. Like my AP Psych subject area test is literally 2 weeks away as of today. And the research has actually shown that you create a greater sense of urgency in people who are prone to procrastination if you break the time frame down into smaller increments of duration, rather than saying 2 weeks, like I don't want to just like look at 2 weeks, break it down day by day, and even the hours that you have, because chances are, if you're like most students, you're probably in class from like at least 8 a.m. to 3:30, maybe somewhere in there. So like that's 8 hours that you don't have time to study for AP exams. I mean, unless you're doing some of that in class, or maybe a study hall or something like that. So you might only have like 2 hours every evening that's really discretionary time for you. And that might be generous for some people. If you're working, like it might be half an hour a day that you have discretionary time. So if you've got, if you've only got half an hour each day for 14 days, like you don't have 2 weeks and you don't have 14 days, you have 7 hours left to study. And that feels really different than saying like, I've got 2 weeks, right? So in that half-hour space that you have every day, write in the topics that you're going to be studying, and like what specific units that you need to address. So if you're down to shorter timeframes, obviously you got fewer sessions, so you really got to focus on high impact items. But I take a diagnostic test and map it out from there.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Hi, Mrs. Welle. I'm not sure if this is something I have an AP Physics test coming up, and I noticed that one of your tips was like relating content to your personal life. How would you do that with more like math and science-based subjects?
Yeah. So I had one of my intro physics teachers in college had this thing that he would do where every week we did have to do a real life application of whatever physics concept we were learning about. So he'd make us, when we were calculating like the independence of motion that's like vertical and horizontal in the trajectory of like a projectile or something like that. You had to pick something that you had actually seen do that in real life, and then use the formulas to like plot where it's going to land and that kind of stuff. So you might have to get sort of fantastical about it, but even in physics, I think there's a lot of stuff that you could like. I vividly remember doing one where I watched a squirrel like launch off my deck or something, and then like had to figure out where he was going to land based on like the time that it took for him to reach the ground. So like, not everyone's me, but I would incorporate animals as much as possible, like squirrels, unicorns, bears that you're running from. I tend to go to cute animal examples. I know not everything in physics lends itself to that, but like, make some fun real life examples if you can. Like some of them are harder than others, I know.
Perfect. Thank you.
I have a quick question. So say we ignored all of your advice and ended up having to cram for an exam like the night before. What would you say would be the most effective strategy to during those few hours that we do have the night before the test?
Okay, yeah. Okay, so worst case scenario, it's the night before the test, and I'm just gonna guess, like, I don't know, maybe you got 4 hours or something, 3, I don't know, like, I don't know what the whole night means to you. Okay, so for one, do remember that there is a law of diminishing returns in staying up late studying. There's actually, I should have put that diagram in here. There's some really good research that was published just a couple years ago that showed, getting REM sleep, the sleep where you're dreaming and like, so getting decent sleep between a session where you studied something to mastery, and then when you're asked to recall it in later, really makes a difference in terms of your attention. So resist the temptation to like pull an all-nighter. Like don't actually stay up all night until the 7 a.m. exam the next day reviewing, because you're probably going to be groggy. You're not going to recall it that well. It's not going to, it'll be a lot of time not spent efficiently. So with just like 3 or 4 hours, I do still think retrieval practice and practice testing is probably going to be your most efficient go-to, but I would do it in a really targeted way. So most AP exams now are arranged into 9 units. The College Board is trying to make that uniform, for better or for worse, across the different subject areas. So what I would do is I would limit myself to, figure out, if you got 3 hours, divide that evenly between those 9 units. Unless you happen to know, because some subject areas are like this, some course topics don't quite meet that percentage. Like psych is one of them. I don't know. I'm not an expert on all the others, but like, there's some that like, 33% of the exam is going to be this one unit or something like that. So if you know that, then spend more time on that one. But otherwise, divide them up kind of evenly. Do some diagnostic testing for each one. So do some practice questions first. If you've only got 20 minutes on each of those 9 topics, practice questions first, find the ones that you got wrong, correct any misconceptions. If you know it's something you're going to need to commit to memory, use a mnemonic or a memory strategy, like some fun rhyme or an acronym that might help you commit that to memory, and then force yourself after that 20-minute increment to move on. So you've like covered all the major areas. So you're still doing retrieval practice. You're using that to guide your studying, but you may have to force it into like smaller sections and force yourself to move on and still get sleep, because sleep is important. It might also be important to remember, like, especially for people who might be inclined to cram or like feeling that they're in a time crunch. It's also, if you're at that point, not worth shoulding yourself, like, and putting guilt, like the guilt is just going to be extra and get in the way at that point. Because if you spend all evening like cursing yourself for not having made better choices about studying, well, that's now just interfering with your studying more. So like, give yourself some grace, play it from where it lays. Like, here we are, let's just do the best we can with what we have.
Perfect, thank you. Fingers crossed I won't have to use your advice on that one, but just in case.
Right, like that's worst case scenario. Instead, do the plan. But like, yes, if you find yourself in that spot, be forgiving yourself and do your best.
Awesome, thank you.
I have a couple questions.
Mhm.
Okay, so how do you motivate yourself, like, if you don't like the subject? Like, I find myself like I'm really interested in some subjects, so I want to study and I want to learn more. But then there's others like I have to absolutely like push myself to study for. How do I make myself want to study more of that subject, I guess?
Yeah, what a great question. So I think the answer to that might depend a little bit on who you ask. So like different people might have different perspectives on where to go with it. So some of this might be a little bit personal opinion on my part, but 2 things. For one, even if it's a subject that you really don't like, you might be able to connect it to some higher purpose that is intrinsic for you. In the psych lingo, intrinsic motivation is when we're doing something because we enjoy it, because it gives us meaning and purpose, and that's what we find satisfying about it. So like, for example, okay, in my background in psychology, I had a lot of classmates who were motivated by the urge to help people. So they were training as counselors or psychotherapists because their primary aim was they want to help people. They do also have to take research methods and stats classes, which they sometimes did not like because that wasn't really what drew them to the field, right? Even though I would argue stats can be very interesting, and that's my bias. But so for some of them, they were taking classes that they're like, stats, blah, like why do I have to calculate z-scores? This is crazy. Like what? Like I'm never going to use a t-test, like whatever. So like but the way that you could kind of get through it is connecting it to that higher purpose for you, that this may not be something I like, but it is something that is going to help me ultimately be successful in my chosen career and field. And that's why I'm doing it. Like it's a step on a pathway to this other thing that I like. So you can kind of like backdoor alley-oop that kind of motivation by connecting to some higher purpose. The other things that you might do, if you can't do that, there are some productivity and like motivation folks that would tell you, let's not rely on motivation. Like motivation comes and goes. It fluctuates even if you do like a topic. So there are some folks that would tell you the mistake is even on relying on motivation at all. Because it doesn't matter if you feel like doing something, you can still do it, whether you feel like doing it or not. So a lot of like productivity people will tell you just to make a system that makes it habit, and it doesn't give you much other choice but to do the thing at a scheduled time. So if you get in a routine where you consistently always do my homework during this space, like, and just always do it regardless of whether you feel like it or not, it's no different than like a weightlifter who, you know, some days you feel like going to the gym and some days you don't. Even if you're going to like put up bad numbers or not do a good lift that day, you still go in kind of religiously every day. So making routines surrounding that could help. The other thing that might be helpful too is like, ooh, there's this thing in the motivation research called temptation bundling, or like productivity bundling, where like the trick to getting yourself to do something that you don't like is by inserting within it something that you do. For a lot of students, that's studying with friends and socially, right? Like, so none of us like studying this subject, but we're going to study together, and that means we get to make cool inside jokes and like do all kinds of other cool things, you know. So we get to entertain ourselves while we're doing it, and we get to spend more time together, right? So that could do it. It's not much different than like people who, like a typical application of that is like, oh, maybe you don't like exercising, but if you do exercise, like if you go on your walk or you run and you like listening to a podcast, that's the time when you listen to the podcast. So it's like, I've got something to look forward to, even though I'm kind of dragging myself through the thing that I didn't want to. So you could bundle stuff, you could link it to intrinsic motivation, or you could just not rely on motivation at all and just make it habit, consistency, and behavior. But yeah, it's a hard problem to, it's a hard thing to tackle, but hopefully we gave you some ideas.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. I have another really quick question, sorry.
Mhm.
Okay, for some subjects where like you just need to like sit down for a few hours and just study for a while, how do you make sure your mind doesn't get diverted by like other things? And how do you make sure you study most effectively at like one stretch?
Yeah. Okay. So one, like there's different tricks that people use for that. One thing I think is important is to remember that your brain's probably not built to just focus on one thing for like 3 hours at a time. So it is okay to notice drifts in attention. Like you're going to have peaks and troughs in how much you're able to focus. Sometimes you're going to notice that you're really killing it. And then other times you're like, you know, you find your mind wandering. Over a 3 hour period, that's pretty normal. So you don't have to negatively judge it and tell yourself that you're doing it wrong if that's happening. But one thing that helps me when I'm have to like force a lot of productivity, if you you can actually find online timers for this all over the place. It's called the Pomodoro technique. It's from the Italian word for tomato, because like some people have these tomato shaped like kitchen timers or whatever. But the idea is that you, within a time frame, you schedule time that you're going to be on and then time that you'll be off, and you'll let yourself do a fun thing or let your mind wander. So if you're just starting with it, we usually encourage people to start small. So like set a timer for like 10 minutes. If you're having a real hard time focusing, like 10 minutes. And if you've done your math homework or whatever for 10 minutes, then you can take a few minutes off to maybe watch one YouTube video or something like that. And then another 10 minutes and then whatever. But you can up it from there. For me, I use like 45-15 as my increment. So if I put the timer up there, you can watch it count down, you can hear it count down, and you know, like it doesn't matter how far I get, but as long as I'm on task for this 45 minutes, then I know I've got 15 coming up where I can go and make myself some tea, or I don't know, watch some YouTube video about cats, you know, whatever your distraction is that you need for 15 minutes before you'd start again. So like, you know, plan in the breaks. Like, you know, you need to reward yourself for that time on task, and you might not be able to. Focusing for 3 hours straight is a really tall order for anyone.
Alrighty, it looks like that might have been our final question for the evening. So if we could all give Mrs. Welle a huge thank you in the chat, that would be amazing. Or you can use the reaction features. But Mrs. Welle, is there anything else that you'd like to say before we all sign off this evening?
Oh, well, thank you so much for inviting me. And for sure, good luck to everyone in meeting your goals on the either AP exams or tests that are coming up for you. I hope you find what we talked about tonight helpful as you're making those plans.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mrs. Welle. We really appreciate your time this evening. And thank you everyone for coming. And we know that it's a very hectic time for all of us with school and studying and everything. So thank you for taking this time out of your evening to do this session with us. So thank you. Have a great night, everybody.